Grant Holloway was not a man who got excited easily. He had spent 14 years in the diplomatic corps, sitting across tables from creatures with 6 arms, no eyes, and tempers like solar flares. He had once talked a Gorath warlord out of destroying a mining station by sharing a bag of dried apricots. He had once sat completely still for 9 hours while a Krell elder hummed at him in their traditional greeting ceremony. He had learned, through long years and many uncomfortable chairs, that the most powerful thing a human being could do in a difficult room was simply remain calm. So when the transmission warning light blinked red on his console that afternoon, Grant did not rush. He was halfway through a bowl of tomato soup, the good kind, made from a packet his sister had sent in the last supply drop. It was warm and slightly salty and exactly what he wanted. He tucked his napkin more firmly into his collar, reached over without standing up, and accepted the incoming transmission. The screen filled immediately with gold and black. There were 12 of them. 12 Velthari War Council members in full ceremonial armor, standing in a perfect curved line on the bridge of what Grant recognized as their flagship, the Undying Verdict. The armor was impressive, he would give them that. Deep black plating edged in hammered gold, tall crested helmets shaped like the heads of their ancient war beasts, and ceremonial blades hanging at every hip. Behind them, the great viewport showed the dark curve of open space. They had positioned themselves carefully. Everything about the image was designed to be overwhelming. Grant spooned up a mouthful of soup. The central figure stepped forward. He was taller than the others, broader across the shoulders, and his crest was highest. Grant recognized him from the intelligence files. Supreme Commander Velthari, leader of the Velthari War Council, veteran of 11 campaigns, and the individual responsible for 3 separate border skirmishes in the last decade alone. He was, by any measure, a formidable being. His yellow eyes found the camera and locked onto it with the kind of stare that was meant to make lesser creatures forget their own names. Grant dipped his spoon back into the bowl. Velthari began to speak. The declaration was long. Grant had read similar documents before, written by other species in other centuries, and they all followed the same general shape. There was the opening statement of grievance, listing every wrong the enemy had supposedly committed. Then came the formal announcement of intent, full of language about honor and destiny and the righteous fury of the people. Then the demands, usually impossible ones, because the demands were never meant to be met. And finally the closing statement, which was always some version of the same thing: submit or be destroyed. Velthari delivered all of it with great seriousness. His voice was deep and resonant and carried the particular quality of someone who had practiced this speech many times. The other council members stood perfectly still behind him, their posture rigid, their expressions carved from stone. Somewhere off to the side, Grant could see a junior officer holding a ceremonial banner. The whole thing was clearly intended to be a moment of historic gravity. Grant finished half his soup. He noticed the flagship's interior lighting was slightly warmer than standard Velthari military specification. Interesting choice. It made the gold on their armor look richer. Someone on that ship had an eye for visual presentation. Velthari reached the closing statement. His voice dropped lower, which Grant knew from experience meant they were approaching the most dramatic part. The Supreme Commander spread his arms slightly, a gesture that in Velthari body language indicated absolute finality, and declared that the human presence in contested space was an act of war, that humanity's trade policies were an act of war, that humanity's silence in response to previous warnings was itself an act of war, and that the Velthari Empire, in the name of its people and its ancient honor, hereby declared full and total conflict against the human species effective immediately. He held the pose. The council held their pose behind him. The junior officer with the banner held his pose. Grant set his spoon down. He picked up a small piece of bread from the side of the tray, used it to catch the last bit of soup near the edge of the bowl, and ate it. Then he looked up at the screen properly for the first time since the transmission began. He studied Velthari's face for a moment. Then he looked at the council. Then he looked back at Velthari. He reached up and removed the napkin from his collar, folded it once, and set it beside the tray. Then he spoke. His voice was pleasant and unhurried. He thanked the Supreme Commander for the thorough presentation. He said that he had followed the declaration closely and understood that it represented a matter of significant importance to the Velthari people. He said that he respected the seriousness with which the Council had approached this moment and that he intended to give their declaration the full and careful response it deserved. And then he asked, in the same pleasant and unhurried voice, whether it would be acceptable to schedule that response for after 1400 hours station time. Because the soup was still warm, he explained, and he hated to waste a good meal. He smiled once, politely, and waited. The silence on the other end of the transmission was not a short silence. Velkaratha's pose had not changed. His arms were still slightly spread. His expression was still carved from stone. But something behind his yellow eyes had shifted in a way that was very difficult to describe. It was the expression of a being who had prepared extensively for a specific kind of moment and had arrived to find an entirely different kind of moment waiting for him instead. The council behind him did not move. The junior officer with the banner did not move. Nobody on that bridge appeared to know what to do with what had just happened. Grant waited with the patience of a man who had once sat still for 9 hours while being hummed at. Finally, Velkarath closed his arms slowly. His jaw moved once, without producing a sound. Then it moved again. Grant tilted his head slightly, in the polite way that meant he was still listening. The transmission ended. Grant looked at the blank screen for a moment. Then he looked at his soup. There was still a little warmth left in it. He picked up his spoon, pulled the bowl back toward him, and finished it. When the bowl was empty he set it aside, opened his console log, and typed a brief incident report. 6 lines. Factual. He marked it routine, attached the transmission timestamp, and sent it to Diana Marsh at the Department of Diplomacy on Earth. Then he set an alarm for 1,345 hours, leaned back in his chair, and closed his eyes. The soup had been very good. Grant slept well. He always slept well after a difficult afternoon. Other diplomats he knew had trouble with that. They would lie awake running conversations back through their heads, checking for mistakes, worrying about what came next. Grant had never seen the point of that. The conversation was finished. The soup was eaten. The alarm was set. There was nothing useful that worrying could add to any of those facts. He woke at 13:45, splashed water on his face, combed his hair, and put on a fresh jacket. He did not yet know that the galaxy had spent his nap in a state of complete panic. It had started within minutes of the transmission ending. Someone on Nexus Station had been monitoring the diplomatic frequencies, which was not unusual. Many people monitored the diplomatic frequencies. What was unusual was what they had heard, and the speed with which they shared it. By the time Grant's alarm went off, the recording had already been copied, clipped, translated into 19 languages, and broadcast across every major galactic news channel from here to the outer colonies. The headline wrote itself. Human Envoy responds to war declaration by asking for lunch break. Every species in the known galaxy saw it within the hour and every single one of them came to a completely different conclusion about what it meant. The Gorath, who were large and grey and had built their entire civilization around the concept of dominance, watched the clip 3 times in a row on their command channels. Their senior war speakers gathered in emergency session. After 2 hours of heated argument, they reached a unanimous conclusion. The human had done it deliberately. The casual eating, the folded napkin, the polite smile. It was a performance, carefully calculated to project total contempt for the Velthari Empire. It was, in Gorath terms, the most aggressive possible response short of actual weapons fire. They sent an urgent diplomatic message to their ambassador on Nexus Station instructing him to find out immediately what other weapons the humans were hiding, because a species that relaxed about a war declaration was a species that knew something nobody else did. The Krell saw it differently. The Krell were small and quick and communicated primarily through movement and chemical signals. Their analysts spent 40 minutes watching the clip on repeat, paying particular attention to Grant's hands, his posture, and the precise angle of his head when he spoke. They produced a detailed report that circulated through their hive network within the hour. The report concluded that the human had displayed the behavioral markers of an apex predator in a state of complete rest. The soup, they argued, was significant. A creature that feeds calmly in the presence of a declared threat is a creature that does not perceive the threat as real. This meant one of two things. Either the humans had a defense system so complete that war held no practical consequence for them, or Grant Holloway specifically was a being of such individual capability that 12 armored Velthari Council members did not register as a concern worth interrupting a meal over. Either possibility was alarming. The Krell ambassador on Nexus Station was instructed to stay indoors until further notice. The Pelari, a quiet and philosophical species who communicated in long careful sentences and were generally considered the most measured thinkers in the known galaxy, published a brief statement saying that they did not know what to make of it and that they thought perhaps nobody else did either, and that this was itself an important piece of information. Nobody paid much attention to the Pelari statement. It was too reasonable for the current mood. On Nexus Station itself, the reaction was immediate and physical. The station had a population of roughly 40,000 beings from 30 species, all living and working in the layered rings of the Great Hub. Within an hour of the clip spreading, the main commerce deck had dropped to half its usual foot traffic. 3 separate species had quietly moved their vessels to the outer docking rings, which were farther from the human diplomatic vessel but also closer to the jump lanes. The station coordinator, Felix Rowe, who was human himself and therefore deeply familiar with how other species tended to react to human behavior, spent most of his afternoon on the communication channels reassuring department heads that nothing was actually happening. Nobody was entirely reassured. Felix eventually gave up on reassurance and switched to simply asking people to remain calm and stay at their posts. That worked slightly better. On the Velthari flagship, the Undying Verdict, things were considerably worse. The War Council had not moved from the bridge for 3 hours after the transmission ended. They stood or sat in various states of rigid stillness, and they argued. The argument was not loud, because Velthari of senior rank did not raise their voices, but it was intense in the way that cold things are intense. Supreme Commander Velkhoroth sat at the head of the council table and listened to all of it with his yellow eyes half closed. The central question was simple. What had the human meant? Junior Admiral Sornvel, who was the youngest member of the council and therefore the one most willing to say things out loud that others were only thinking, put it plainly. Either the human was the bravest being any of them had ever encountered, or he was the most foolish. The problem was that in 14 years of diplomatic service the human had never once done anything foolish. That left only one option. And that option was deeply uncomfortable to sit with. Velkhoroth said nothing for a long time. Then he said that they would wait for the response at 1,400 hours as requested and that they would make no further moves until they had heard it. The council did not argue with that. Nobody wanted to be the one who pushed forward and found out what the human had been so calm about. Grant, meanwhile, was unaware of most of this. He straightened his jacket, poured himself a glass of water, and checked his console before heading to the meeting room. There were 43 unread messages. He scrolled through the subject lines without opening them. Most were from news agencies requesting comment. Several were from other diplomatic vessels on the station. 2 were from species ambassadors he had never personally met, which was unusual. And at the very bottom of the list, time-stamped 40 minutes ago, was a message from Secretary Diana Marsh at the Department of Diplomacy on Earth. He opened it. It was one line. It read, "Try not to start anything before the trade summit." Grant read it once. Then he read it again. Then he closed the message, picked up his cup of tea, which he had made while the console was loading, and walked toward the meeting room. He was not worried. Diana always kept her messages short when she was not worried either. If she had been genuinely concerned, she would have sent a full briefing document with 3 attachments and a suggested response framework. One line meant she trusted him to handle it. That was good enough for Grant. He had a meeting to get to. Grant arrived at exactly 1,400 hours. Not 1 minute early. Not 1 minute late. He walked through the connecting corridor between his diplomatic vessel and the Velthari delegation bay with his cup of tea in one hand and his datapad tucked under his other arm. He had changed into his formal diplomatic jacket, the dark gray one with the small Earth insignia on the left collar, but he had not bothered with anything more ceremonial than that. He had considered it for about 4 seconds and then decided against it. Ceremony was a language, and right now he wanted to speak a different one. The delegation bay doors opened as he approached. The room was impressive. The Velthari had clearly spent some time preparing it. The walls were draped in black and gold, their ceremonial colors, and the lighting had been set low and cool in the way that made their armor look its most dramatic. The council table was long and dark and carved from something that looked like stone but probably was not. 12 chairs on the far side. 1 chair on the near side, smaller and positioned slightly lower than the others, which was a very old negotiating trick meant to make the single occupant feel outnumbered and diminished. Grant looked at the single chair for a moment. Then he walked around the table, pulled out one of the 12 chairs on the Velthari side, moved it to a spot roughly in the middle of the long edge, carried it back around to the human side, and set it down next to the original single chair. He sat in the one he had just moved. It was the same height as the Velthari seats. He set his tea on the table, put his datapad flat beside it, and looked up. 12 Velthari council members were staring at him. Velkhoroth stood at the head of the table. He was still in his ceremonial armor, all of them were, and the effect in this lighting was exactly as intended. Imposing. Ancient. Serious. His yellow eyes had found Grant the moment he walked in and had not moved since. Grant looked at him pleasantly. "Good afternoon," he said. He used Velkhoroth's name and his full title, pronouncing both correctly, which took most humans considerable practice because Velthari names had a particular low resonance in the second syllable that human throats did not produce naturally. Grant had been practicing Velthari pronunciation for 6 years. He had a small recording on his console that he listened to on quiet evenings. It had been worth the effort. He saw the slight shift in Velkhoroth's expression when the name landed correctly. Not warmth exactly. But something. Recognition, perhaps, that the person across the table had done their homework. Grant gestured toward the empty seats. "Please," he said. "Sit." There was a pause that lasted several seconds. Then Velkhoroth sat. Then the council sat, one by one, in a kind of slow careful sequence like stones being placed. Junior Admiral Sornvel was the last to sit and did so with the stiff posture of someone who was not sure what the correct response to any of this was. Grant picked up his tea, took a small sip, and set it back down. He did not speak immediately. He had found over the years that silence at the start of a meeting was useful. It let the room settle. It let the other side use up a little of their prepared energy simply waiting. And it gave him time to look at faces properly, which was always informative. What he saw across the table was interesting. Velkhoroth's expression was controlled. Professionally so. But his hands on the table were very still in the particular way that hands are still when their owner is concentrating on keeping them that way. The 2 senior council members flanking him had the careful blankness of experienced soldiers who had decided not to show anything until they knew what they were dealing with. But several of the others, the younger ones, the junior members sitting toward the far ends of the table, were doing something different. They were watching Grant with an attention that had a specific quality to it. Not hostility. Something closer to wariness. The kind of wariness that lives next door to fear. That told Grant quite a lot. He opened his datapad. He did not make a speech. He did not open with a statement of the human position or a counter-declaration or any of the formal structures that galactic diplomatic protocol suggested for this kind of meeting. He simply looked down at the datapad, found the first entry on his list, and began to read aloud in the same pleasant conversational tone he used for everything. He started with the supply lines. The Velthari military ran on 7 primary supply corridors connecting their home systems to their outer fleet positions. Grant read out each corridor by its Velthari designation, gave its current operational capacity, noted the 3 points along each one where disruption would be most consequential, and mentioned which of those points were currently within range of existing human logistics vessels. He was not making a threat. He was simply reading the information in the same way he might read out a list of train times. He moved on to the fuel depots. There were 4 main ones and 2 secondary ones. He gave the location of each, its current estimated reserve capacity based on the last 6 months of shipping traffic data, and the average resupply interval. He noted which ones were showing signs of reduced inflow over the past quarter, which suggested either budget constraints or a deliberate drawdown in preparation for extended operations. He did not say which he thought it was. He just noted it. Then he read the drydock schedules. The Velthari had 4 major drydock facilities producing or refitting warships. Grant went through each one, named the vessels currently in refit, gave estimated completion dates based on publicly available construction contract data and cross-referenced shipping manifests, and noted which classes of ship were being prioritized. He observed, in a mild and passing sort of way, that the prioritization pattern suggested the Velthari Admiralty had been planning for extended deep space operations rather than short border engagements for at least 18 months. He said all of this in roughly the same tone a person uses when reading a weather report. His voice never rose. He never looked up from the pad with any expression other than mild concentration. He never used the word threat or warning or consequence. He simply read the list. By the time he finished the drydock section, the room was very quiet. Not the prepared quiet of a council waiting to make its move. A different kind of quiet. The kind that settles over a room when everyone in it has just privately recalculated something important. Grant set the datapad flat on the table. He picked up his tea. It was still warm. He took a small sip, set it back down, and looked up at Velthari with the same pleasant and unhurried expression he had been wearing since he walked in. He waited. The silence in the room had weight to it. It was not the heavy silence of a standoff, where 2 sides face each other waiting to see who blinks first. It was something different. It was the silence of a room full of very experienced beings who had just encountered something they had not prepared for and were quietly trying to understand what it was. Velthari had been in many difficult rooms in his long career. He had sat across from Gorath warlords who breathed threats like other beings breathed air. He had negotiated with Krell hive speakers whose entire mode of communication was designed to disorient. He had once spent 6 hours in a room with a being whose species had no concept of compromise whatsoever and had come out of it with a workable border agreement and a mild headache. He was not easily unsettled. But he was unsettled now. Not because the human had threatened him. That was the thing he kept returning to as he sat at the long dark table and looked at Grant Holloway across it. The human had not threatened him. He had read out information that could absolutely be used as the foundation of a threat, information that was detailed and accurate and clearly gathered with considerable care, but he had not actually made one. There had been no if you do not comply. No or else. No darkening of the voice at the critical moment. Just a list, read aloud in the tone of a man describing what he had for breakfast. Velthari had spent 3 hours on the bridge of the undying verdict after the soup transmission trying to work out what kind of being Grant Holloway was. He had read the human's diplomatic file. 14 years of service. Dozens of resolved conflicts. A record notable more for what it lacked than what it contained. No dramatic confrontations. No famous speeches. No moments of recorded brilliance. Just a long quiet list of problems that had somehow stopped being problems after Grant Holloway sat down with them. Looking at him now, Velthari thought he was beginning to understand why. The human was not performing calm. That was the thing. Velthari had seen performed calm many times. It had a particular quality, a kind of careful stillness that revealed itself under close observation as effort. This was not that. Grant Holloway was simply calm in the way that certain landscapes are calm. Not because nothing was happening, but because whatever was happening was entirely manageable from where he was standing. It was, Velthari thought, either the most honest thing he had ever seen in a negotiating room or the most sophisticated deception he had ever encountered. And after several minutes of looking at the human's face, he was beginning to suspect it was the former. Which was, in its own way, more difficult to deal with than the latter. Grant set his datapad flat on the table and looked across at Velthari quietly. Then he asked his question. He did not ask it dramatically. He did not lean forward or lower his voice or use any of the physical signals that in most species indicated that an important moment was arriving. He just asked it in the same easy conversational tone he had been using since he sat down. He said that he had shared the information not because he wanted anyone in the room to feel cornered but because he believed that good conversations needed an honest foundation. And then he said that he would like to have a good conversation if that was possible. And then he asked what the Velthari Empire actually wanted. Not what the declaration had said. Not the formal position. The real thing underneath all the ceremony. He picked up his tea and waited. The council did not move. Velthari's expression stayed controlled. The two senior members flanking him stayed blank. But at the far end of the table something was happening. Grant had noticed it before he asked the question and he noticed it more clearly now. Junior Admiral Sornvel had the posture of someone who was fighting a losing battle with themselves. He was sitting very straight and very still in the way that people sit when they are concentrating very hard on not doing something. Grant looked at him for just a moment. Not pointedly. Just a glance, the way you might glance at a door that is slightly open. That was enough. Sornvel broke. Not loudly. It came out of him quietly and all at once, like air leaving a small space. He said that the border colonies were struggling. He said that the food shipments had been declining for 8 months and that 3 of the outer settlements were already rationing. He said that they had looked at the human trade rerouting data and the timing matched and the volumes matched and they had concluded that it was deliberate. That humanity had quietly decided to strangle the Velthari outer reach without the inconvenience of an actual war. He stopped speaking. The room was very still. 2 of the senior council members were looking at Sornvel with expressions that suggested he had done something that was going to be discussed at length later. Velthari was not looking at Sornvel. He was looking at the table in front of him with the careful stillness of a being who had just heard something said out loud that had been sitting unspoken in the room for a long time. Grant set his cup down. He did not look surprised. He did not look satisfied in the way that people look when they have successfully extracted information they were hunting for. He looked, if anything, slightly sad. The way a person looks when they hear something and understand immediately that it did not need to be this way. He was quiet for a moment. Then he asked, very gently, why nobody had simply sent a message. Not an ultimatum. Not a formal diplomatic communication with 17 signatures and a ceremonial seal. Just a message. From one office to another. Saying that the border colonies were struggling and asking whether the trade rerouting could be looked at. Sornvel stared at him. Grant looked back at him with complete seriousness and waited for an answer. Sornvel opened his mouth. Then he closed it. Then he looked at Velthari, who was still looking at the table. Then he looked back at Grant. He said that it had not seemed like something the humans would respond to. Grant asked why. Sornvel said that humanity's diplomatic responses over the past year had been slow. That requests sent through official channels had gone unanswered for months at a time. That it had begun to feel deliberate. Grant was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded slowly. He said that the diplomatic office had been understaffed for 14 months following a budget restructuring and that the response delays were real and he was sorry for them. He said that slow was not the same as deliberate but that he understood how one could look like the other from the outside. He said that if a message had reached him directly it would have been answered within the day. He said this simply and without any performance of regret. Velthari finally looked up from the table. For the first time since Grant had walked into the room, the Supreme Commander's expression had changed. Not into warmth. Not yet. But the stone had shifted. Something underneath it was visible now. Something tired and practical and considerably more human than anything Grant had expected to find. Grant looked at him quietly and waited. Nobody ordered lunch for the meeting. That was fine. Grant had not expected anyone to. The Velthari did not eat during formal proceedings. It was considered a sign of weak focus, the idea that a body needing food could not be fully committed to the matter at hand. Grant had read that in a cultural briefing years ago and had always thought it was a shame. In his experience, most difficult conversations went better with something warm to drink and something small to eat. People were more honest when they were comfortable. Comfort had a way of loosening the knots that pride tied. But he did not say any of that. He simply opened his data pad to a fresh document, set it flat on the table where both he and Velthari could see it, and asked if they could start with the most urgent thing first. The most urgent thing was the border colonies. Sornvel, who had said more in the last 10 minutes than he had probably planned to say in the entire meeting, provided the details quietly and carefully. 3 settlements in the outer reach were already on reduced rations. 2 more were approaching that point. The supply shortfall had begun 8 months ago when the primary human trade corridor through the Verith Passage had been rerouted 2 systems north, adding significant travel time and cost for the Velthari distributors who depended on it. The rerouting had been a human infrastructure decision, Grant knew, related to a debris field from a collapsed relay station. Nobody had flagged it as a diplomatic issue because nobody had been talking to anyone. Grant typed as Sornvel talked. He did not interrupt. He did not offer reassurances before he had anything solid to offer. He just listened and typed and occasionally asked a short clarifying question. How many people in the 3 settlements? What the monthly shortfall looked like in specific supply categories. Whether the Velthari distribution network had capacity to absorb redirected shipments if the routing issue was addressed. Velthari watched all of this from his seat at the head of the table. He had not said much since his expression had shifted. He was listening in the way that senior commanders listen when they have decided to let a situation develop rather than drive it. Grant respected that. It took a particular kind of discipline to sit quietly at the head of your own table and let someone else run the shape of the conversation. It meant Velthari was more interested in a real outcome than in appearing to be in charge of the process. That was a good sign. After about 40 minutes Grant had enough to start drafting. He worked through it point by point and read each one aloud as he wrote it so that anyone in the room could object or correct before it became part of the document. He kept the language simple. He had learned long ago that complicated legal language in agreements was usually a sign that someone was hiding something inside the complexity. Simple language meant simple accountability. Both sides could read it and know exactly what they had agreed to. The first 3 points dealt with the immediate supply situation. Emergency shipment rerouting through the closer corridor, temporary cost subsidies to bridge the gap while permanent adjustments were made, and a 30-day review mechanism so that both sides could flag problems before they became crises. The next 4 points dealt with the structural trade relationship. Clear channel designations for Velthari distribution access, a joint monitoring committee with representatives from both sides, a formal communication protocol so that operational changes with cross-border impact had to be flagged in advance, and a dedicated diplomatic contact on both sides with a guaranteed response time of no more than 72 hours. Grant paused on that last one and looked up at the room. He said that the 72-hour guarantee would apply to the human side immediately and that he would put his own contact details into the document as the initial point of contact until a permanent arrangement was established. He said this without drama. Just as a practical matter. Sornvel looked at him for a long moment. Then he said that 72 hours was acceptable. The remaining 5 points covered longer-term items. Trade volume baselines, dispute resolution procedures, a 6-month review schedule, a framework for expanding the agreement to other affected systems if the initial implementation went well, and a final point that simply stated that both parties agreed to communicate directly and promptly when problems arose rather than allowing them to develop into larger situations. Grant read that last point aloud and left a small silence after it. Nobody objected to it. He turned the datapad to face Velthari and slid it gently across the table. Velthari read it. He read it slowly and completely, which Grant appreciated. Some leaders sign things without reading them properly and those agreements rarely held. Velthari read every point and when he reached the end he went back and read 2 of them again. Then he set the pad flat on the table and looked at Grant. He asked one question. He asked whether humanity intended to honor this or whether it was simply a way to delay the conflict. Grant looked at him steadily. He said that he had no interest in delay. He said that if the Velthari border colonies were struggling because of a routing decision that nobody had communicated properly, then the right thing to do was fix it. He said that was the entire reason he was in this room. He said it plainly, without emphasis, and meant every word of it. Velthari held his gaze for several seconds. Then he reached out, picked up the datapad, and signed it. The council chamber was very quiet as he did it. Not the tense quiet of before. Something different. The particular quiet of a room where something has just been settled and everyone present is taking a moment to absorb that fact. Grant transmitted the signed document to Diana Marsh on Earth before he stood up from his chair. He added a brief note at the top. 12-point agreement attached. Velthari signatures confirmed. We'll debrief fully tomorrow. Then he sent it and put the datapad under his arm. He shook Velthari's hand. The Supreme Commander looked at the offered hand for just a moment, then took it. His grip was firm. Grant's was firm back. Sornvel, to everyone's mild surprise including his own, said thank you. Grant told him he was welcome and meant that too. He walked back through the connecting corridor to his vessel, set his jacket over the back of his chair, and went to the small kitchen unit at the back. He took the bowl from lunch out of the warming compartment where he had left it. The soup had gone thick and the bread was slightly dry but it was still good. He sat down at his small table and ate it slowly and without rushing. When he was finished he opened his daily log, typed 9 words, and closed it. Conflict resolved. Soup was worth it. He washed the bowl, turned off the main lights, and went to bed. Outside, across every news channel in the galaxy, analysts and ambassadors and war speakers and hive minds were still trying to explain what had just happened. How a formal war declaration from one of the most powerful empires in the known galaxy had become a trade agreement in a single afternoon. How one human with a cup of tea and a datapad had walked into a room full of armored commanders and walked out with 12 signatures. Nobody could quite agree on an explanation. Grant slept through all of it. He had always slept well after a good meal.